Slightly better?
Slightly.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Can everybody hear me in the back? A little bit echoey? Good? You can understand the words inside? Okay, good. A little bit? Okay. I'm sorry. It's the open space sometimes. Well, welcome everybody to our 5th ConocoPhillips IRIS seminar. And yet another good one. I know I say that every single time we have one of these. But today we are very blessed to have a great speaker with us from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovins. To give you a little bit of background on Amory, he's a physicist, he's an ex-Oxford Don, an honorary U.S. architect, a Swedish engineering academician, and he told me to make sure I mention that he's a Harvard and Oxford dropout. Did you guys know that? Yeah. Technically, I'm an Oxford dropout too, because I was in Oxford for one summer semester and left. He's written over 570 papers and 31 books. He's taught at 10 universities. He's redesigned numerous buildings, vehicles, and factories, and advised industry governments for over 40 years in 65 countries, including Canada and Alberta. He's a U.S. National Petroleum Council member, and he advises the Chief of Naval Operations there. He received what's called the Alternative Nobel, Blue Planet, Volvo, Sayed, Oasis, Nissan Shingo, and Mitchell Prizes, MacArthur, and Ashoka Fellowships. Only, I have 13, he only has 12 honorary doctorates. So one more and he'll catch up. And the Heinz Lindbergh National Design and World Technology Awards, Time named Amory one of the world's 100 most influential people, and one of the top 100 top global thinkers. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amory Lovins.
Thank you. If I back off a little, does that make the sound less fuzzy? Yeah. Thank you. Very good to be here. Are there any Welsh people in the audience? No? Well, anyway, dewi sant hapus, happy say David say Wales. March 1st. Okay, disruptive oil futures. 4/5 of the world's energy comes from digging up and burning each year about 20 cubic kilometers of the rotted remains of primeval swamp goo. The industries that do this with immense skill are the 3rd biggest sector of the U.S. economy. I don't know what the Canadian fraction is, but it must be significant. And I'd like to tell you a story about how such big industries can be transformed by big discoveries, and I'll focus on oil. In 1850, there were no cars and no oil wells. Most homes were lit by substances extracted from whales and burned in lamps. And whaling was the U.S. 5th largest industry. In a century, it grew to global dominance and even exported to Europe, and then it suddenly disappeared. What happened? Strong demand and global hunting made whales shy and scarce, so the price of whale oil and sperm oil went up as fleets got bigger but less productive. So the prices got volatile and shot past those of coal oil. And then lamp conversion kits emerged, and Michael Dietz's clean burning model paid back in months and flipped the market in 3 years. So in the 9 years before Drake struck oil in Pennsylvania, he struck rock oil or petroleum. Whale oil lost over 5/6 of its lighting market, and the whalers were astounded to run out of customers before they ran out of whales. The remnant whale populations were saved by technological innovators and profit-maximizing capitalists until those same forces of industrialization killed even more whales in the 20th century. So whale oil lost to coal oil and town gas. They lost to Rockefeller's kerosene, which 2 decades later lost to Thomas Edison's 20-fold more efficient electric lights. And those then got 11-fold more efficient over 130 years. Then better new kinds of lamps slowly followed. But then, like a thunderbolt, came white LEDs, And each decade they got 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, and 10 times cheaper. In the next 5 years, they're expected to take 2/3 of the world's general lighting market. 2/3 of Americans already buy them. I assume they're similarly popular in Canada. They're rocking the $200 billion a year global lighting services market. And since lighting uses 1/7 of the world's electricity, they're disrupting utilities' old business model, which is to sell a commodity, not a service or an infrastructure, so customer efficiency cuts their revenues rather than their costs. Edison got that right until they overruled him in 1892, and we've been selling commodities ever since. Now, the oil and gas industries, too, grew up selling molecules, not the energy services customers wanted, like mobility and hot showers and cold beer. So that is catching up with them as efficiency accelerates from the sedate pace of the old lamps to the blinding speed of LEDs. And yet most fossil fuel companies pay as little attention to competition from radical energy efficiency as the whalers paid to Michael Dietz's new lamp. What else changes this fast? Well, LEDs turn electricity into light. Photovoltaics, PVs, turn light into electricity. And in the past 5 years, their meteorite strike has fatally disrupted electric utilities by making solar power cost less than the fossil fuels we feed into traditional power plants. Wind power, the lower aqua curve here, is now so cheap that it often makes coal and gas and even nuclear plants shut down as uneconomic to run. And photovoltaics are now less capital intensive than Arctic oil, not counting the ability to use electrons far more effectively than molecules. Efficiency is even bigger and cheaper. My 2014 shelf paper, Efficiency, the Rest of the Iceberg, explains how oil companies can run their supply-side tankers into the hidden efficiency iceberg and sink without even knowing what they hit because they weren't properly tracking efficiency, so it wasn't really on their chart. Which oil and gas markets are in danger of disruption? Nearly all of them. Over decades, reserves unburnable for climate reasons could well be smaller than reserves unsellable for competitive reasons. That is, oil companies are even more at risk from market competition than from climate regulation. If the oil business sputters at $90 a barrel and stalls at 50, how will it do against the $25 cost of getting U.S. mobility off oil? What if the biggest challenge were not falling price, but vanishing demand? Are the competitors other hydrocarbon companies? Or are they people like these whose innovations could be to the oil business as Dietz's lamp was to whalers? Some of their innovations are technologies, but most of them are more disruptive than technologies. They're new business and financial models, breakthrough design methods, all stirred vigorously with IT. And these new vectors of transformation all reinforce and speed each other in a fertile mix with innovative policies, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, new development patterns, shifting tastes and values, and Silicon Valley culture and speed. 7 billion largely linked minds can scale global change non-linearly, especially when technology becomes vernacular. The world has now more cellular connections than it has human beings. 1/3 more people have cell phones than have access to a 3,000-year-old technology called toilets, because toilets take slow public investment in infrastructure, but anyone can go get a phone and often it's free. Now, world oil consumption has historically trended slowly upwards, almost regardless of price. But if we plot the two against each other, price on vertical axis, we see an evolving roller coaster ride with repeated loop-the-loops, and who knows what happens next. When price rises enough, demand falls, that is, we go back to the left, and then price crashes, and the commodity cycle repeats. So far, the oil savings have come from incremental technologies moving at the pace of big, slow industries in old, stodgy markets. But what if technologies as stunningly fast and game-changing as LEDs in lighting move demand dramatically back down towards the left? So let's examine that possibility, starting with the biggest user of oil, the automobile. The U.S. pays most of $2 billion a day for oil products, plus another $4 billion a day for the economic and military costs of its national oil addiction. And nearly half of that oil fuels automobiles. So let's start by making autos oil-free. Now, 2/3 of the energy needed to move a typical car is caused by its weight. And every unit we save with the wheels by reducing weight, or drag or rolling resistance, saves 6 more units we needn't waste getting it to the wheels. So we save 7 units of energy at the fuel tank. Huge leverage. It's exactly Peter's asymmetry principle. But for the past quarter century, epidemic obesity has made our 2-ton steel autos gain weight twice as fast as we have. Happily today, though, we have ultralight, ultra-strong materials like carbon fiber composites that can make dramatic weight savings snowball and can make autos simpler and cheaper to build. Lighter and more slippery autos need less force to move them, so their engine gets smaller, and those vehicles' fitness then makes electric autos affordable because their batteries or fuel cells get 2 or 3 times smaller, lighter, and cheaper, so their sticker price will fall to about today's level with far lower driving costs per kilometer. And this specific sequence of innovations can transform automakers from wringing tiny savings out of essentially Victorian steel stamping and engine technologies to the steeply falling cost of 3 mutually reinforcing technologies: ultralight materials, their structural manufacturing, and electric propulsion. And if you are exploiting 3 steep and synergistic learning curves while your competitor is out on the flat part of one learning curve, you win. The relative pace keeps changing, of course, between ultralighting and electrification, but a strategy with rich optionality can capture their combined benefits no matter which horse pulls ahead. And in this race, it's wisest not to bet on any particular horse, but on the entire race, which at least one horse will surely win, and to make very sure that you're racing horses and not oxen. Now, the sales of ultralight electric vehicles can grow and their prices can drop even faster with a temporary fee-bait, that is, rebates for efficient new autos paid for by fees on inefficient ones. And those ought to be size neutral and revenue neutral. The biggest of 6 fee-bait programs in France tripled the speed of improving auto efficiency in the first 2 years. And the strongest one in Norway gave plug-in cars 22.3% of last year's market, which is 34 times the US market share. A strategic shift that is underway in at least 4 to 7 automakers, depending on how you count it, emerged at my organization in 1991, and then it spread pretty fast in '93 when we open sourced it. So our $3 million of soft money R&D was leveraged in the next 7 years into at least $10 billion US of industry commitments. Now, 16 years ago, we designed with a pair of European Tier 1s a half-normal weight carbon fiber hybrid electric SUV, boosting efficiency by 4 to 6-fold with a 2-year payback. So that's 3.6 liters per 100 kilometers on gasoline, 2.1 on hydrogen. 9 years ago, Toyota showed such a car that has the interior volume of a Prius, half the fuel use, and 1/3 the weight, 420 kilos. Now, 1 and 2 liter equivalent per 100 kilometer cars, carbon fiber electric cars, as we proposed in '91, are on the market from Volkswagen and from BMW, which confirms that the carbon fiber in the i3 is paid for by needing fewer batteries. And by the way, that model last I looked, which was last November in North America, was outselling the combined total of the 1, 2, 3, 7, X, and Z. It was about 9% of their North American unit sales. Now, there's an even faster and cheaper manufacturing technology than these German firms are using among about 17 competing processes, and it made this carbon fiber carbon cap in 1 minute about 9 or 10 years ago. Let's pass this around. It's stuff. You don't walk off with it. I need it back. But that's an interesting artifact. It's tougher than titanium. Tom Friedman whacked it with a sledgehammer as hard as he could and couldn't even scuff it. And the technology for making such materials into complex 2x2 meter parts in 1 or 2 minutes is now in the global supply chain. You can buy it from German tier 1 press maker called Diefenbach. If we made all U.S. autos in this way, it would save 1.5 Saudis or half an OPEC by drilling in a very prospective play we call the Detroit Formation. And the cost of those mega barrels is $18 US per saved barrel and falling. That's to pay for the electrification. The ultralighting turns out to be approximately free because it's paid for by a 2/3 smaller powertrain propulsion system and by radically simpler automaking with 80% lower investment, because you need no body shop, probably no paint shop, about 98 or 99% less tooling, about 5 assembly stations. So you get rid of the hardest and costliest steps in today's automaking. And you can see there the structure of our SUV, which is really suspended from rings, not built up from a tub. It's really like an airframe, and there's only 14 parts in the body compared with 10 or 20 times more in a typical steel body. And by the way, each part is made with 1 low pressure die set. A steel part would normally be made with an average of 4 progressive high pressure steel stamping dies. So you start to see where the capital savings come from. Now, auto's context extends way beyond oil. Thomas Edison on the right invented the electricity industry, and a few decades later, Henry Ford, who used to work at Detroit Edison Company, industrialized the automobile fueled by John D. Rockefeller's oil. And these 3 energy sectors transformed humanity, but at their core, they have changed remarkably little for a century. If these 2 guys took a really long nap on one of their car camping holidays together and woke up and saw their businesses today, they'd recognize almost everything except the electronics, and they'd catch on to that pretty fast. And yet today, their industries face vast disruptions because we've got 21st century technology and speed colliding head-on with 20th and even 19th century institutions, rules, and cultures. Now, oil and electricity, the 2 big stories here, each emit 2/5 of fossil carbon, and they're only 4% connected globally, less than 1% in the US. But as we might imagine Ford mischievously muttering to Edison, let's see what happens when electricity displaces automotive oil, and then those electric cars add flexibility and distributed storage to the electric grid, helping efficiency and renewables to displace giant power plants and the fossil fuels that they burn. Electric cars, especially heavy ones, you need thousands of batteries, each about the size of a double A. And that production volume is making batteries rapidly cheaper. Last year, Tesla announced price drops for home power systems that are consistent with what they pay for automotive batteries, but 3 years sooner than mainstream analysts expected. And Tesla expects at least another 30% price drop this year, next year from its Gigafactory, and then more after that. There are also some interesting new chemistries emerging. Now, this is going to speed both getting cars off oil and switching electricity production from fossil fuels to renewables. Moreover, the distributed storage in electric cars that we buy anyway for mobility helps to integrate variable solar and wind power into the grid, making the oil and electricity problems easier to solve together than separately. Automotive physics and business logic also apply to big vehicles. Walmart's heavy truck fleet, for example, now uses half the fuel it did a decade ago to move a case of merchandise. That includes smarter logistics, but just the technological improvements in Class 8 trucks can profitably at least triple their efficiency, maybe as much as quintuple with some new engines that just emerged. And that plus the triple to quintuple efficiency airplanes designed at Boeing and NASA and MIT can move 0.9 trillion US dollars net present value from oil companies' top line back to customers' pockets just in the United States. Now, in both heavy and light vehicles, today's military revolution in energy efficiency will speed these advances in the civilian sector, which uses over 50 times more oil. I like that leverage. Much as military R&D created the internet, the GPS, the jet engine, and microchip industries, only this time speeding our journey beyond oil so that both our countries' warfighters can have neg emissions in the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea. Mission unnecessary. They really like that idea. Autos are not just heading up for 4 to 8-fold higher technical efficiency, they're also being driven less. Generations X and Y tend not even to want to own a car because it's cheaper and easier not to. Smartphones now bridge the once annoying wrap gaps by summoning ubiquitous transport services on demand. There was a San Franciscan lady whose blog I was just reading who was saving 11,000 US dollars a year by replacing her car with Uber, Lyft, public transit, walking, biking, and GetAround, which is a smartphone app for renting your neighbor's car when it's unneeded and parked, as US cars are about 95% of the time. By the way, if you ever do need a car, you don't need to own it. Just like you can have a great dinner without owning the restaurant. In some Chinese cities, renting a Kandi, K-A-N-D-I, electric vehicle from this giant vending machine costs about $3 US an hour. And also, renting shared cars when you need them can boost their 5% utilization by about tenfold and then probably redouble it with partly or fully autonomous vehicles like this Mercedes-Benz concept car, or the ones being developed by the world's two most valuable companies, Apple and Google. Autonomy drops electric vehicles' total cost per kilometer at least 40% below that of fuel vehicles because they're driven so many more kilometers that they're roughly tenfold lower energy cost per kilometer, more than offsets their higher sticker price. For example, an Uber EV electric vehicle in Los Angeles recently logged over 600 kilometers, 8 fast charges and 1 medium speed charge in a day. So imagine what the economics look like if you're running a fleet with that kind of utilization and you're using electricity very efficiently instead of gasoline very inefficiently. This doesn't depend on what the oil price is, it's a winner. So the mobility IT mashup means radically fewer vehicles disrupting automakers and all-electric vehicles driving fewer total kilometers, further disrupting oil companies while delivering better access, especially to those now underserved, including our increasing elderly population. Self-driving cars are also part of a much bigger shift because autos are morphing from what we call PIGs, that is, personal internal combustion gasoline steel-dominated vehicles, to SEALs. I need a good graphics morph here. SEALs are shareable electrified autonomous lightweight service vehicles. So that combination of 2 changes in technology and 3 in business models simultaneously, all strongly reinforcing each other, that there goes oil companies' biggest market. And not only are vehicles transforming, so are the ways we use them, starting with new urban design. Nearly half the world's new cars were sold in China back in 2010, when only 5% of Chinese people own cars. And yet this 100-kilometer traffic jam took 12 days to unsnarl. Yeah, I'll run that forward, it doesn't look good. Building roads causes traffic, so politicians are figuring this out and starting to change the rules. In Tokyo, for a long time now, to buy a car you have to own a parking space. Denmark taxes new cars at 180% plus a 95% duty if they weigh over 2 tons, plus an annual tax on their inefficiency. In Shanghai, a license plate now costs more than the small car you put it on. In smoggy Beijing will happily register your electric car instantly for free, but if you want a fueled car, a new one, you have a 1% chance in the lottery for the right to buy a registration. If you can't breathe, it really gets your attention. Cars are being phased out in central Copenhagen and Helsinki. Singapore and Oslo inspire London's nearly $40 a day fee to drive your car downtown. That shifted peak period commuting to 85% public transit, cut congestion 30%. China now has over 200 million electric vehicles with 2 wheels, mostly displacing motorcycles and maybe a fifth of them replacing cars. Then there's China's 3,000 kilometers of bus rapid transit, which may quintuple in the next 5 years, transforming the Hangzhou Street on the left to the street on the right, same street, except this one carries now 800,000 riders a day on these multiple buses which pull up to a surface subway-like station where you've already paid your fare, and big doors open all at once so people push on and off the train, and it's a 1-minute headway. So you achieve subway route density at 5% the cost. There are now almost 200 cities doing this, carrying about 30 million commuters. China plans in the next 15 years to build new cities for as many people as America now has, and designing those cities around feet, not cars, results in 2/3 less driving and 1/3 less concrete. So integrating and then distributing where people live, work, shop, and play means people don't need to travel far nor by car. And shifting from this arterial vehicle network to a capillary web of bus rapid transit and biking and walking and one-way car streets builds a human ecology with vibrant commerce, rich social life, but equal or better throughput, cleaner air, happier citizens. And I repeat, 2/3 less driving. And 53 cities already doing this, and more to come, are not going to use much oil. So even in the US, where we've already built our cities around cars, and without the pigs to seals transition or some of the other latest innovations, we can greatly enhance mobility, notice the subtitle up here, while phasing out oil. We can first get technically efficient by technologies that are included or overlooked in the official forecast. Then we can use vehicles more productively. That includes improved freight logistics and also getting the same access from 46 to 84% less driving by new urbanist design, IT integration, and charging real-time driving costs per kilometer, not per liter. Then we can switch fuels, but there isn't much left. That's all the fuel we need compared with this much now. So super efficient autos can use any mixture of hydrogen fuel cells, electricity, and advanced biofuels. Heavy trucks and airplanes can realistically use advanced biofuels or liquid hydrogen. Trucks can even burn natural gas, but no vehicles will need oil. And any biofuels needed, and most 3 million barrels a day for the US, could be made 2/3 from waste without using any cropland and without harming climate or soil. In fact, we would pay farmers and ranchers for taking carbon out of the air and sticking it back in tilth where it belongs. Is your business model ready for this? Now, even 6 years ago, some mainstream analysts were beginning to see peak oil not in supply, but in demand. And sure enough, US gasoline use has now been falling for 9 years, European for 11. Like whale oil in the 1850s, oil is becoming uncompetitive even at low prices before it becomes unavailable even at high prices. Natural gas is also no longer a safe haven for oil companies. It just goes away more slowly. Efficiency, renewables, and cogeneration displace natural gas for generating electricity, if they're all allowed to compete fairly. Not yet the case in Alberta, alas. Together, these three non-fossil fuel competitors got over $630 billion of global investment just in 2013. It's now a lot bigger. And they often beat even the most efficient combined cycle gas-fired power plants just on operating cost. Their advantage widens further if we count the market value of gas's price volatility, $2 or $3 a gigajoule. You can discover it from the straddle of the options market. And we should, of course, count that for fair comparison between gas with volatile prices and efficiency renewables with constant price, because there's no fuel. And they delivered a constant price for decades. So that makes a big difference too, and we ought to count that in auctions. Gas-fired heat will also be gradually displaced by efficient buildings, smarter industrial processes, and solar process heat. Now, over 3 decades, the U.S. wholesale gas price in green has been unrelated to official gas price forecasts in blue. A warning against buying gas-fired power plants based on spot price. The inherent volatility of gas prices complicates risk management, and it deters finance, or at least it deters smart finance. I can already remember 3 times the investors have lost their shirts buying combined cycle plants. One of those, they lost over $100 billion US. Could anything like that happen here? Now, the new story then about abundant and affordable energy for the long haul is less about fracked gas than about its inexhaustible, benign, carbon-free, and stably priced physical hedges, namely efficiency and renewables, that are outpacing it and increasingly outcompeting it. Here's a bigger picture of energy efficiency. In 1975, U.S. government and industry all insisted that the energy needed to make $1 of real GDP could never go down. A year later, I heretically suggested it could drop 67% in 50 years. In the first 39 years, it's dropped 54%, and yet just the innovations already done in far more powerful new technologies and design methods, enlightened regulation, maturing financing and marketing and delivery channels, can save another 3-fold, as we showed in Reinventing Fire. That's twice what I originally thought, and at 1/3 the real cost. And now, 5 years after that book, I'd have to say even that looks conservative. I can get into examples in discussion if you like. If total primary energy use in the United States had grown with the economy at the 1975 level of energy usage per dollar of GDP, we would have used this much energy. Instead, we cut that by more than half, and the cumulative energy thereby saved in the past 40 years is equivalent to 21 years of U.S. energy use at the current rate. In those same 40 years, total renewable energy output has doubled. Yay! And yet it had a cumulative impact 31 times less than the savings. Just in 2014, renewables grew briskly, but energy savings grew 3 times more. Would you gather that from the headlines? I doubt it. Energy efficiency is invisible. It's the stuff you don't use. Really hard to visualize. It's not like, solar panels on the roof and wind machines on the horizon. Furthermore, the low-hanging fruit keeps growing back faster than we can pick it, because the unbought efficiency resource keeps getting bigger and cheaper as we supposedly deplete it. By even more than expected, because of an innovation from our little black swan hatchery that we call integrative design. Let's see what it can do, and I'll start with buildings which in the US use a third of the directly burned natural gas and nearly 3/4 of all the electricity. You might think that I would burn a lot of gas to stay warm 2,200 meters up in the Rockies near Aspen, where it used to go to minus 44 Celsius on occasion. We do with altitude what you do with latitude. But my house does no combustion. That's so 20th century. And indeed, it has no heating system. Super insulation, ventilation, heat recovery, super windows that insulate like 16 or even 22 sheets of glass, but look like 2 and cost less than 3, make it 99% passive solar heated. And eliminating the heating system more than paid up front for the efficiency that displaced it. Also saving 90% or so of household electricity and half the water. 99% of the water heating energy still all yielded a 10-month payback combined. And by now the energy savings have paid for the whole house. Now if you come into this central atrium, seen here in a February snowstorm, we've now produced 62 passive solar banana crops with no furnace, and without needing to look like this, my house helped inspire over 40,000 European passive buildings that likewise have no heating and roughly normal construction cost. 4 years from now, all new EU buildings must use nearly zero energy, and zero in California for new commercial buildings, followed 10 years later by new residential buildings. This design approach actually works from Old Snowmass to Bangkok, a range of climates sufficient to cover practically everybody in the world. But wherever you live, integrative design gives many benefits from each expenditure. So the white arch that holds up the middle of my house has 12 functions, but it has only one cost. That's one of our recent banana crops, twins, 30 kilos. They harvest themselves by pulling down the tree. How fast is the state-of-the-art moving? Well, our 2010 retrofit of the Empire State Building first remade the windows into super windows on site so they would pass light but block heat and insulate several times better. And that shrank the chillers, saving $17 million in capital cost and more than paying for the super windows and cutting the total payback to 3 years. And that 38% energy savings seemed pretty good until our cost-effective retrofit 3 years later saved 70%, making this even more difficult half-century-old federal complex in Denver more efficient than the best new U.S. office, which in turn is only half as efficient as our own new office, built 4 years later, opened last month, with no central heating and cooling equipment. All passive, net exporter. My favorite room is the Nega Mechanicals room, where I want to outline on the floor with industrial tape like bodies in a crime scene where the boilers and chillers were supposed to go until we designed them out. By the way, even in sweltering India, our partners likewise save 80% of the energy at 10 or 20% lower capital cost, and then the rooftop photovoltaics make the rest, just as in our building and in my house. And yet, in this more than doubling of new office and retrofit office efficiencies in the past 5 years, all the technologies were already available over a decade ago. What's mainly improved here is not technology, but design, how technologies are chosen and combined. And most people don't think of design as a scaling vector, but it's a very important one. Let me show that with an example from industry, which uses half the world's energy, and in the US can save $500 billion NPV dollars worth of energy. Dow Chemical actually already returned over $9 billion US dollars on a $1 billion efficiency investment. But there's much more to do. For example, industry owns most of the motors that use 3/5 of the world's electricity, and half that motor power runs pumps and fans. Yet integrated design made a typical industrial pumping loop use at least 86% less energy, not by getting better pumps and motors and controls, but just by replacing long, thin, crooked pipes with fat, short, straight pipes. This also shrank the pumping equipment and the total capital cost. So this isn't a new technology. It's a between-the-ears retrofit. It's rearranging our metal furniture as designers, and doing this to all the world's pump and fan systems would in principle save about 1/5 of the world's electricity, or half the world's coal-fired electricity, or more than all of the gas-fired electricity. And the payback is typically under a year on retrofit and less than 0 in new build. Is your company doing this? And what does such savings mean for the electricity that's 3/5 used in motors? Peter, here's your asymmetry principle writ large. From the coal burn of the power plant to the end use, many successive losses compound, so only 1/10 of the energy in the coal comes out the pipe as flow. But now let's turn those compounding losses around backwards, and every unit of flow or friction that we save in the pipe compounds back to save 10 units of fuel and cost and pollution and carbon emissions back at the power plant. And as you go back upstream, the components get smaller and the total capital cost goes down. And yet I haven't seen any engineering textbook that tells you to start your savings downstream. In over $40 billion worth of diverse industrial redesigns for global firms, our team has typically found energy savings around 40 to 90%, with generally lower capital cost in new build, or in retrofit about 30 to 60% with 2 or 3 year paybacks. That will displace a lot of natural gas, both directly and in power stations. And the big savings and expanding returns from integrated design are not yet in any official study or industry forecast. Now, in 2011, 60 colleagues and I published a very detailed but readable synthesis called Reinventing Fire, introduced by Shell Oil's President Marv Odom and Exelon's ex-chairman and CEO John Rowe. And it showed in detail how the U.S. in 2050 could need no oil, no coal, no nuclear energy, 1/3 less natural gas, running a 2.6-fold bigger economy than in 2010, with triple efficiency and quintuple renewables, $5 trillion cheaper in net present value, assuming carbon and all externalities are worth 0, a conservatively low estimate, emitting 82 to 86% less carbon, and needing no new inventions and no acts of Congress. Instead, enabled and sped by smart subnational policies, our states, your provinces. In mindful markets, the transition could be led by business for profit. If you like any of those outcomes, any one or more will do, you can support this transition without needing to like every outcome and without needing to agree about which outcome is most important. So focusing on outcomes, not motives, can turn gridlock and conflict into a unifying solution to our common energy challenge. And I'll show you in a minute how the U.S. is doing on this, but similar strategies have also been detailed in Europe. They're emerging worldwide, and the latest example will be published in a few weeks by our Chinese consortium, which did a similarly rigorous synthesis by about 57 analysts over the past 2.5 years. It's led by the National Development and Reform Commission's Energy Research Institute and written to inform the 5-year plan being published this Saturday, whose energy authors were our customers. We found that China could by 2050 achieve 7-fold higher energy productivity, 12-fold higher carbon productivity, clean air, 4/5 less coal burn. Encouragingly, their coal burn actually went down each of the past 2 years, even as the economy grew. 82% non-fossil electricity, and 2/5 lower carbon emissions. And the net present value and cost of doing this would be about $3.7 trillion less than business as usual. So it's analogous to the US findings, except bigger savings partly because of bigger structural change still going on in the Chinese economy, partly because they're a bit less efficient to start with, despite exemplary improvements already, and mostly because they're still building so much infrastructure, and it's a lot easier to build it right than fix it later, as we must all do. Now, if reinventing fire for the U.S. could be a model for developed countries, and reinventing fire in China might be a model for developing countries, I wonder if both together might offer a model for profitable climate protection for the world, built on these two countries' growing collaboration to solve the energy and climate problem together. And really what emerged in this work in the U.S. and China is that to solve the energy problem, we just needed to enlarge it and integrate it. And the results may at first seem incredible, but as Marshall McLuhan said, only puny secrets need protection. Big discoveries, he said, are protected by public incredulity. But there is a troubling gap opening between where the market is headed and where many giant energy companies concentrate their attention. It's not universally true, because for the U.S. reinventing fire scenario, the first 5 years of this 40-year journey seem broadly on track for GDP and renewable electricity generation. And for both primary energy intensity and electric intensity, they have the correct slope, but they're a year or two delayed. Some of these fluctuations, by the way, are due to weather and some of the politics. These are not adjusted for either. They're just raw data. But are our industries on the supply side really ready for where this is headed? I think most oil company strategists overlook much of what I have just told you. And in fact, when I gave a similar talk to the Oslo Energy Forum a year ago, it was clear that hardly any of them had seen the competitive landscape fully laid out before. In the past year, the oil price crash has focused executives very understandably on frenetic cost cutting, because price must always exceed cost. But it's easy to forget the other part of the business imperative, requiring that value must exceed price. If competitors offer a superior value proposition, and like a car that people buy because it's better, not just because it's efficient, think Tesla S, profitably delivering petroleum products does not mean your customers will buy them. If insurgents grab the customers and revenues first, it doesn't matter how well you run your oil company and whether it's profitable on the stuff it's no longer selling. The whaling history actually illustrates this. When competition crushed demand for whale oil and sperm oil, its price at first shot up, and Peter just taught me that's because of the Civil War destroying a lot of the whaling ships, but indeed the timing is exactly right for that, I'm sure he's right. But you notice that even after that, the price was for quite a while higher than down here, which is not what you'd expect from reduced demand. But the important point is that the subsequent price collapse, and then it just went off the chart, did not persuade lost customers to return. The coal oil lamps had already taken the whale oil lamps market since 1857. And from the early 1880s, electric lights beat both of them. So what mattered was not price elasticity of demand for oil, but to burn in abandoned old lamps, but rather customers' irreversible substitution of new lighting technology that doesn't need lamp oil of any kind. It's kind of like saying, gee, if all this efficiency succeeded, energy prices would drop. Well, would people take the insulation out of their attics? I don't think so. How fast can this happen? The speed can be breathtaking. Tony Seba is a Stanford innovation lecturer with a nice book called Clean Disruption. And he's recently found a couple of images that I dug the originals out of in the National Archive of U.S. automotive history. On New York's Fifth Avenue, looking down the Easter Parade, in 1900, you have to look hard for the first car. Anybody see it? There it is. 13 years later, you have to look even harder for what might be the last horse. Even harder to see, I'm not even sure there is a horse there. The horse and buggy industry thought it had many decades to adapt. You'd have to build all the traffic lights and filling stations, all that infrastructure. But Henry Ford just made the Model T 62% cheaper in 13 years, 1908 to 21. And the car-owning households in a decade ending 1928 soared from 8% to 80%. 3/4 of them using a newfangled GM and DuPont innovation called car loans. Well, today, photovoltaic modules, instead of getting 62% cheaper in 13 years like a Model T, just got 80% cheaper in 5 years. 3/4 of California's rooftop solar is innovatively financed with no money down, and Ford's and Edison's industries are merging. This horse and buggy thinking is dangerous, but it's pretty prevalent. My Canadian friend who just died, the former oil and Marie Strong, once remarked that not all the fossils are in the fuel. But DuPont's former chairman, Edgar Willard, reminds us that firms hampered by old thinking won't be a problem, he said, because they simply won't be around long term. They're forgetting that the pace of transformation, as we see here, is set not by incumbents, but by insurgents, who are not inhibited by the incumbents' business models, cultures, or legacy assets. In fact, investors flee even before customers do, because capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. They act on leading indicators, gut hunches, herd behavior, all spreading at the speed of Twitter. And once the capital markets think you are in or heading for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done before they decapitalize you and invest in your successors. For example, here's how a 2003 automotive startup called Tesla Motors gained half the market cap of General Motors while selling 0.6% as many cars. Investors still have a lot of scar tissue from big old strong companies' failure that, when they didn't survive the IT transition. But they got rewarded by those that did. Many investors now sense that the energy industries are starting to be transformed beyond recognition, so they're getting skittish. And these changes are happening well within current planning horizons and even within current executive tenures, faster than many firms' cultures can tolerate. So that creates a formidable leadership challenge. As Jack Welch said, if the rate of change on the outside is greater than the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. So which of the great companies on the left will be brave enough to make that perilous crossing and join the firms on the right, of which I guess this one just had a failure of nerve at the board level? Which category will you choose to encourage? And should hydrocarbon companies, so important here, ignore, deny, resist, diversify, hedge, finance, transform, or decline? That's a lot of choices. What can oil companies do? My Shell paper a couple of years ago summarizes the discouraging fundamentals that have shifted many firms from oil to gas, but gas isn't that durable a business either. Some hydrocarbon firms tried investing in renewables without the astuteness and patience they devote to E&P, so they're getting hours off of the signal for others to get in and win. Some bets like Total's NPVs or Chevron's at efficiency do look well-timed and strategic, but most of them don't yet. Now, oil companies could hedge by buying a mega-barrel straddle, invest in mobility game changers, so if those succeed, they'll make less money on oil, but more on mobility and access services. Hydrocarbon firms could turn their immense cash flows to financing their successors, drilling for those cheap mega-barrels under Detroit or Sarnia, drilling in buildings and factories to earn returns for their own shareholders instead of someone else's. Some core capabilities like geotechnologies or managing complex, large construction projects could be adapted to new needs, offshore wind, industrial cogen, But whether the companies with extraordinary hydrocarbon skills can learn to thrive in the new world depends not just on competencies, but also on cultures. Few big companies have survived the switch from doing a few big things to doing many smaller things. The clearest example, IBM, had a near-death experience along the way. It no longer makes PCs, and it wouldn't have made that transition without a brilliant and disagreeable CEO from completely outside the industry. Strategically shifting marginal investments from big, slow, lumpy, risky E&P into small, fast, granular, safer efficiency and renewable projects, much more than the industry is now doing tactically, could probably turn around risk-adjusted expected returns rather dramatically. If you don't believe it, try the pro formas, you'll be astonished. But it's hard to do new things your culture doesn't really believe in. And a competitor can beat you even if you don't believe in its offering. Perhaps the only silver lining for hydrocarbon owners is that their reserves hydrogen is worth more without than with the carbon, even if nobody pays you to keep carbon out of the air. And the reason is the hydrogen can be used so much more effectively than hydrocarbon that you'll make more money taking hydrogen out with a reformer than adding hydrogen in a refinery. Think about it. We're doing the wrong thing with that precious resource. Mendeleev got it right. I mentioned the simplest chemical element because today's energy transformation is not just fundamental, it's elemental. The first industrial revolution was the age of carbon, creating our prosperity, the economy of this province, the world's mightiest industries, out of coal and oil. But now the obsolete age of carbon is giving way to the modern age of silicon. Silicon microchips and telecoms and software turn people from isolated to networked and systems from dumb to smart. Silicon power electronics make electricity interconvertible and precisely applicable, replacing fiery molecules with obedient electrons. Silicon solar cells enable the ascent of energy from mining the fires of hell, that's the classical metaphor for hot sulfurous stuff down there, to harvesting the breath and radiance of heaven. So let me end, as I began, with the old story about how the whalers went broke by ignoring Michael Dietz's new land. And that story's last chapter is now playing out in oil's last lighting market, which, if it were a country, would rank 8th in carbon emissions, plus huge health costs. It's the kerosene lamps in the huts and hovels of 1.2 billion people with family income around $2 US a day or less, and little prospect of getting or affording grid electricity. Before 2014, they were paying $38 billion a year in US, and I don't think it's much less now because most of the cost is logistics and markups, not crude. So they were paying a fifth of the total global cost of lighting services to reduce very inefficiently 1,000th of the world's light. But now those kerosene users can banish darkness and teach their daughters and son to read, because an entrepreneurial village woman can sell or lease them an integrated, very efficient PV, LED, high temperature lithium battery and controller package like this Waka Waka, Swahili for shines brightly. It's a Dutch technology with such high component efficiencies that the form factor is really small. You tuck it right in your sari when you go off to work in the field. Nobody will steal it while you're away. It'll shine 10 hours at this very high intensity. This part fits on a Coke bottle, so it shines down on the table to read with. Or you hang it from whatever you like. And it'll shine 150 hours at the 4th setting per charge. And a charge is 1 day in the sun or about 2 days in the cloud. So financed through scratch cards or through the smartphone that it recharges through its USB port. This pays back in weeks to months against kerosene. It's like a perpetual annuity that gives you an extra month's income every year. So there goes the last bit of Rockefeller's 155-year-old kerosene business. Which of these offerings is more exciting and lucrative and transformational? To which of these strategies would you entrust your company's fate and Alberta's future and our common future? Thank you for your kind attention, and we look forward to hearing what's on your minds.
Just a couple of administrative pieces before we get into Q&A, because we're almost at time and I know some of you may have to go. One is that there is a little feedback sheet, and I'd love to have that feedback for today's session, and then our next IRIS will be on April 14th around shared value and collaboration. So with that in mind, we will take a couple of questions. Namely, we'll stay for a little bit after the session is over. There's a microphone right in the middle, so if anybody has 2 or 3, and then we'll call it a day. Thank you.
And while we're doing that, can we pass the carbon cap back up, please? Thank you. Sir.
Thank you for your talk. My head's swimming. The question is the fundamentals regarding energy return and energy invested. And the power of petroleum and fossil fuels so far over the last 200 years has been an absolutely enormous return on energy out versus energy in. For the oil industry, you know, in 1930s, probably 100 barrels out per barrel of energy invested. As in 2006, I think there's about 15. Considerable decline, but nonetheless, there's still an awful lot of surplus energy, and it allows us to do stupid things in a big hurry, as we've seen in our society. But reinvesting and rebuilding our society also requires an enormous investment in energy. Just look at the structure of our city and so on. So when do we get to the point where the energy associated comes from renewables like photovoltaics and wind and so on actually is sufficient to rebuild the society and support the development of photovoltaics and wind? Right now we don't build windmills with the energy from windmills or hydro plants and so on. It's all based on fossil fuels. So what do you see is happening in that transition? And can I throw another question in that? Are we then moving gradually away from a growth economy to sort of a Middle Ages economic stability in which, you know, the energy you gain on an annual basis is the energy you expend?
Well, that's a much bigger one. I don't have time to get into, although our book, business book from '99 called Natural Capitalism sheds some light on it. But your first question I'm particularly interested in because I actually helped write the generally accepted accounting principles for net energy back in the 70s. And the short answer is that renewables have, both photovoltaics and wind, for example, have energy paybacks of months with today's technology. In other words, their superior competitiveness in economic terms is mirrored by modest embodied energy content. And also, the fast economic payback means that you start getting energy returns very quickly to cover the energy investment to build the next ones. If you have long lead time technologies, that's not true, and it doesn't take much of a growth rate to run a net energy deficit for a long time, or indeed forever if you keep building long lead time energy intensive stuff forever. So it is actually worthwhile to do the calculations if your energy markets are in severe disequilibrium. That's no longer the case, so the economic and net energy calcs will give you the same answer within a reasonable margin of error that's not worth worrying about. Sir?
Oh, about every 10 years since the mid-70s, I've been listening to you and getting fired up, and actually so fired up that I co-authored a book in 1983 that you wrote the introduction for, where
you seem to have recovered well.
Well, we're still here, but a lot of the things that we had hoped to have happened by now haven't. And although means now exist to make them happen, we seem to be still this problem of path dependence. You know, we're still using QWERTY keyboards, and the capital replacement cycle and the capital cost, as this gentleman mentioned, of these changes.
I'm not sure I get what the question was.
Do you really think this time it's going to happen?
Yeah. Yes, it is happening so fast it makes my head spin too. And I think the thing we need to be very careful about is avoiding bad instabilities and unexpected feedbacks and bad consequences along the way that could be disruptive to our economy, our jobs, our security, our way of life. When with a little foresight in the private and public sector, we could make it a lot smoother. And basically, I think a good foundation for that would be to let or even require all ways to save or produce energy to compete fairly at honest prices, regardless of their technology, type, size, location, or ownership. That's pretty much the opposite of the energy policy most places have. But I hope I live to see it.
Hi, enjoyed the presentation. I've been following your work since Soft Energy Path, so thank you for all the work you have done over many years. I think your presentation is very compelling, the arguments you're making. I'm curious about your take on maybe some of the reasons why we haven't seen the change we have, particularly here in Alberta. I mean, you talked about some of your books being introduced by people like CEOs of major oil companies, so they're listening. I presume that they can understand your argument. But here in Alberta, we still are stuck in, the industry seems hell-bent on achieving the social license and the regulatory framework to build more tar sands plants and pipelines. There doesn't seem to be any change. Do you have any...
No, those are called pre-stranded assets in my book.
Yes. So from your perspective, what is the key stickler here? Why aren't we seeing that change? It seems like it makes a whole lot of sense. Your argument
reminds me of the remark by Hilaire Belloc that if he heard the world were coming to an end, he would go to Belgium because everything happens there 5 years later. Apologies to any Belgians, but I think there's been some degree of inward looking in the oil patch here. I was last here substantially about 12 or 14 years ago, working with some of the major oil sands producers, just starting to rev up, and I was suggesting that what has just happened to them would happen, and it was a bad risk to take, and I'm sorry they didn't take that advice. I think we'd all be happier in the province if they had, but they kind of saw the glint of the fool's gold, and in a different energy system where the theoretical models just keep going towards the upper right, it might have been a good bet. But what they ran into was early stages of what I've described here in the longer perspective. Because when we talk about the overhang in the world oil market coming mainly from fracking in the US and to some degree from oil sands here, that forgets the demand side, which is over half the story. We've seen a lot of oil savings where the growth in demand failed to materialize, where the growth is reversing in rich countries and slowing in developing countries. We're going to see a lot more of that. Watch this Saturday China's 13th five-year plan for a little harbinger. So I think that plus a particular policy environment led to some decisions here that weren't as forward-looking as they could have been. not for any lack of talent, not for any ideological reason. I'm completely apolitical, and I had very good conversations about this with Ralph Klein years ago. And actually he agreed and stuck for about 2 hours that a very good way to extend the Alberta advantage would be to make this the most efficient province in Canada, because every barrel or cubic meter that wasn't wasted could be sold. Still a good idea, all the more so now when cash flows are tight. So when I look around the building stock in Alberta, or I just drive in last night and see the place lit up like a Christmas tree as if light switches hadn't been invented, it means somebody's still not quite paying attention. And I know there's plenty of smart people, there's wonderful engineers here. You just need to continue to get your act together, and I think you have terrific prospects, but you really have to skate where the puck's going to be. That's what I've tried to describe. Thank you.
So Amory's going to be here for maybe 15, 20 more minutes, and I have to drive him straight to the airport. For those of you that were at the Research in Action seminar, you probably heard me ask this already, but how many of you are going to Globe this week? Okay. So you just got to see what Amory will be presenting at Globe. For those of you that can't come to Globe, we have an event with Bob Willard this Thursday for Research in Action. How many of you have seen that event and are coming downtown for lunch on that? Okay. That means there's more people that can come. So if you haven't seen it, let me know or contact us and we'll send you the information. An event like this doesn't just happen. It's through sponsorship of ConocoPhillips that we're very grateful to be able to bring people like Amory here. Secondly, there's somebody that's not here that was very integral in bringing Amory, and that's one of our alumni, Curtis Props, who I spoke with in New York. That's why he can't be here. He lives and works in New York, and for RMI now. But prior to that, he's one of our most distinguished alumni, and we're very proud to have him. So he's one of the key reasons he's here. The last thing I'll mention is that the Peter he keeps referring to is Peter Terzakian, who's in the audience today. So we're glad you came and hope you keep coming. It's great to have you here. So other than that, please join me in thanking Amory one last time and have safe travels.